Imagine a world where people whistle joyfully while walking down the street. Nutritional psychotherapist Julia Ross remembers those days and is aiming to bring them back with contrarian information in her books, The Diet Cure and The Mood Cure. In this show, we'll learn about the connection between mood disorders, cravings, overweight, and protein. We'll also learn the real reasons why deficiencies in any of the 5 brain chemicals you need to be happy result in cravings and compulsive eating. Coming up next on the Nutrition Heretic Podcast.
So I'm sure you've heard that as you age, it gets harder to lose weight. Well, that's total bull because my friends Laura and Veronica Chows, they can prove it. They're a mother-daughter duo, and they've lost 125 pounds between the two of them at ages 50 and 20. And they've kept it off for over 2 years without starvation, deprivation, or hunger. So now you can learn their system and a whole lot more with a free 10-day trial to their online membership. They'll give you the diet, the recipes, classes, and more. Sign up today at nutritionheretic.com/utmostdiet.
Fat is bad for you.
I just pop a pill and I'm fine.
Meat is murder.
It's time for bad food punishment. It's time for real nourishment. It's time for the Nutrition Heretic.
The following program is provided as information only and may not be construed as medical or health advice. It is not intended to diagnose, treat, or cure any disease. No action or inaction should be taken solely on the basis of the information provided here. Please consult with a licensed healthcare professional or doctor on any matter relating to your health and well-being. Hello and welcome to the Nutrition Heretic Podcast. This is Adrienne Hugh, the Nutrition Heretic, and it's good to be back with you. This week, I want to talk about the truth about fat people. This is something that I've talked on and off about, which is that our modern society has taken it upon itself to blame fat people for all of our social ills. And as you know, I don't agree with that. Now, obviously, there are health consequences to being morbidly obese, as the term morbidly obese intends to explain. However, there's so much more going on than people just being gluttons. Many people whom I've come across who are obese, they're actually not eating enough calories. And that's often a shocker, but it really shouldn't be, because almost every diet book today will tell you that when you cut your calories, you slow your metabolism. And when you slow your metabolism, you gain weight. So why then is it that they always induce a starvation component at the beginning of their diet to force people to lose weight? And really, I think it's because of the missing component that we're going to discuss today. And this goes actually deeper. It goes into our moods. And a few weeks ago, I know that I mentioned a French doctor whose books I've been reading, I should say, Dr. Delaboux. He is talking about cravings and how when we have certain cravings, it's because we are not giving our bodies the right fuel. We're not giving ourselves the fats and the proteins that our brain craves. And as a result, we fall into this trap of eating these very starchy, sweet, addictive comfort foods that some people refer to them as comfort foods. Other people refer to them as poison. But in any case, there is a doctor. She was actually the first person to corroborate this when I first started to notice it. Her name is Julia Ross. She is our guest heretic today. She's also the author of The Mood Cure and The Diet Cure. And she's going to talk to us today about the connection between the mood and the weight. Welcome, Julia, to the show.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here with a fellow heretic.
Well, we are heretics because it seems that there's two camps. There's the food pyramid conventional look at things, where you have to have X amount of this and that, and it's all, in this beautiful little pyramid, and we all are supposed to fit into that. And then on the other side, we've got people who are just into starvation in many, very culty ways. They're cutting their calories. They're sometimes half the calories. I believe it was your book that first pointed out to me that many people are dieting on fewer calories or similar to people in concentration camps during World War II.
Or fewer calories.
Exactly. And so, this is something that is really, it's an epidemic, I think, in our country because, and increasingly across the world, although there are, and other than you, almost every other doctor that I've known who talks about this is in Europe. They're all, or from Europe initially. And they're all noticing that we're just cutting too many calories, that the consequence, I don't care how, nutrient dense we think our diets are, once we're going below what I learned from your book, 2,100 calories, we're going into starvation mode. But we're also, it's not just about the weight. It's also about the bone and tooth health. It's also about our moods and how we interact with one another, which are suffering at the hands of trying to induce weight loss simply through calorie restriction. So I want to start out by talking to you a little bit about, asking you about a quote, well, maybe not a quote, but a fact that was in your book, The Mood Cure. And you say that the rates of adult depression and anxiety have tripled since 1990. Explain to us why triple. That's like a lot. And it's getting to the point where I think people are sort of priding themselves on having a mood disorder. What's going on here?
Well, it has to do with something that started in the 1970s, a quiet but complete revolution in the way we ate and the way we fueled our brains, which the brain is the control center for our moods and our appetite. You talked about what the connection is, and we can get to that. But the reason that we can't maintain a positive mood, which we used to be quite good at, Americans were actually famous for their upbeat personalities. And I remember myself growing up, you couldn't go a day without walking down the street and people were whistling, singing even.
I'm sorry, I'm picturing like one of those quintessential 1950s commercials where the guy's just like skipping along the street, whistling to himself.
It wasn't that far off from reality. It never occurred to us not to sing. It was just an expression of our brains being in order. Our brains were well fed because before 1970, although our diet was starting to deteriorate with increased amounts of sugar, but in general, we were eating 3 meals a day. Most of the food was fresh cooked. We never skipped a meal. And we were eating women were eating an average of 2,100 calories, which before 1970, which is where that figure came from. And speaking of figure, there were no weight problems much prior to 1970 when all these dietary changes took place. And once they began to erode our traditional diet, these changes began to erode all of our functions. So it's not just that we're 3 times more depressed, we're 3 times more likely to have cancer, we're about 100 times more likely to have diabetes. It was 2% in the 60s.
Wow.
It's now 55% as of this year's computation. So the majority of Americans are diabetic or on the diabetic spectrum, pre-diabetic or diabetic, it's all the same. So this is a drastic, unprecedented deterioration, really the greatest nutritional crisis in world history. And you wouldn't know it from looking at the literature. We're actually supposed to be eating less of all the traditional foods, less animal protein, less saturated fat. These are both absolute pillars of the traditional human diet for the last 2 million years. Without heart disease, without weight problems, without a cancer epidemic, certainly without a diabetes epidemic in sight. So we made some terrible blunders and have been clinging to them desperately.
Is that just to save face, or do you think this is totally orchestrated just to make us buy every antidepressant, every cancer treatment, every diabetes, insulin drug,
It's hard not to think, but you don't have to choose. It's both. It's definitely greed. Greed is, probably the greatest driving power, because the food industry, it's just incredibly profitable, because the goods, the bads that are being made by this industry are very, very cheap to make.
Right.
And I was just reading a new study, an international study, because of course now all of our weight and health problems have spread all over the world. And this was a study showing that 60% of the American diet, which is of course becoming the diet of the world, is completely nutritionally void, except for calories.
Yeah, exactly.
But I mean, this 60% completely nutritionally void. And then we go on a diet and don't eat anything. So we're we're flying between one form of malnutrition and another. And the brain cannot help but suffer.
Yeah, or I was going to say that one of the things that also happens is that people begin to focus on the foods that maybe are not necessarily as easily absorbed, particularly once we take out the animal proteins and fats. They will brag about how many, beans and vegetables they're getting in their diet, but how much are they actually assimilating once they've removed everything else?
And even if they are assimilating it, which, I pray that they are, they just can't be getting adequate amounts of the essential amino acids that the mood cure is all about. Amino acids. These are the fragments of protein. And these are the required nutrients for any kind of a decent mood. And so the question about a book called The Mood Cure is, well, why do we need a cure? And we need one, and we need a physiological nutritional cure, because our mood problems are primarily problems of protein malnutrition and lack of absorption.
Right. Absolutely. So explain to us what is, we talked about the protein fragments that are called amino acids. So many people, like you, I'm sure you've been on the internet. You've seen people saying, well, you get just as much amino acids or protein from goji berries as you do from a 6-ounce serving of steak or whatever they make up. Kale has so much protein in it, quinoa protein. They're looking at all these plant sources of protein, and it started where I guess back in the 60s, right? With Frances Moore Lappé, she started telling people, you just mix your beans and your rice and you got protein. And now it seems like we've gone beyond just beans and rice. We've gone into fruits and leafy greens as protein sources. Talk to me a little bit about the faulty thinking behind that. Is it faulty thinking? Maybe I'm just putting this on you because this is my view, but is it faulty thinking to believe that you can get everything from a handful of goji berries?
Well, there may be one or two people who can, but we've seen over 4,000 people in our nutrition clinic since the late 80s, and none of them have been able to sustain decent mood, decent mental function, decent weight, decent health in all their efforts to be vegan, to be vegetarian, to mix their protein sources. So I can only say that our experience tells me no, and the history of the world tells me no. When we have hundreds of thousands of years of high function, and suddenly when we cut out the traditional animal proteins and fats, we lose all of our health, all of our weight normalcy. Really, we just need to be very, very observant and simple-minded. We don't have to be theoretical about it. And someone who's lived through the years prior to the change in the 70s and remembers what we ate and how we looked and how we felt, it's easy for me to draw these conclusions, because I've actually seen it in living color.
Right. Yeah. And I grew up in the 70s, and and it was really, I'm not going to throw out any political parties here, but I know that it was in the early 80s where we really started to see that shift, I believe. And, I was a kid, but I still noticed a really dramatic shift. And I remember my mom as an RN would tell us, she would come home with all these new factoids from the doctor about what they should and shouldn't be, what we should and shouldn't be eating. And I really got to say that I think that's when my health started to decline, we never went vegan at the time. But I definitely, looking back, I said to myself, my gosh, that's really where it was like the nail in the coffin for me.
You went low fat.
Yeah, we went low fat.
Everybody else.
And my mom's, against her better judgment, went from butter to margarine because she was told that her cholesterol levels would spike if she kept eating butter. So she went to margarine, and a year later, guess what? Her cholesterol went up. So she was like, well, this didn't happen with butter, so I'm going back to butter.
Good for her. Common sense prevailed for once.
Yes, exactly. And we did have home cooked meals. I do know, I do have several friends whose moms worked. My mom worked as well, but we always had a home cooked meal. It didn't have to be fancy. It could just be some broiled chicken with rice and a vegetable for dinner, for example. Sandwiches at lunch. Like we almost never. I think Fridays was our day to have these little peccadillos. Go and have something from the food truck at school, and maybe go out to McDonald's, which actually back in the 70s was still pretty real food based. And it was.
I didn't know that was ever the case.
I do believe it was comparatively. I believe it was in the 80s when they switched to vegetable oil from tallow. They were using tallow up until then, and that's actually when Julia Child said she would never eat another McDonald's French fry again.
Great fact.
So tell us a little about I'm going to get back to the 3 meals a day, because there's a lot of people out there who are intermittent fasting and they're like, no, you don't need to eat 3 times a day. But tell me about false mood, because I want to kind of explore a little bit more on the mood side before we get into diet.
Well, we started with diet as the cause for the decline of the brain's ability to generate positive moods. And there are 5 parts of the brain, each one, they're called neurotransmitters, and each one of them produces a different kind of positive mood. So we have this sort of orchestra of positive mood that's very natural to us. It's inborn, the ability to rebound from pain and stress and sing and whistle. But if we don't have the nutrients that the brain needs to produce these positive moods, then we don't have them. And we go into the negative moods. It's not like we go from positive moods to no moods. We go to the opposite extreme. So we have depression, we have panic.
We have school shootings.
Yes, we have ADD. The symptoms of a brain that's malnourished are very clear-cut, very well researched. And my book, actually, The Mood Cure, starts out with a questionnaire that allows people to identify which set of false and negative moods do I have.
Right.
And by filling out that 5-part questionnaire, you identify which part of your brain is not producing. And then the next step is to correct the brain chemistry problems by feeding the poor thing whichever amino acid or mix of amino acids is missing to produce it. And we have found over the years, as I say, working with thousands of people, that the change in mood alone generated by people using targeted amino acid supplements, brain-targeted supplements, that transformation becomes evident in about 5 minutes. We have been doing amino acid trialing in our office since about 1996, actually having people fill out the same questionnaire that the Mood Cure begins with, and then giving them the amino acid that's indicated by the score on their questionnaire, and watching people change in front of us. Somebody who, it's very typical for somebody to come in quite depressed, teary, irritable, edgy, really fatigued, sitting back, slumped in their chair. And within 5 minutes, 10 minutes at the most, we start to see them smiling. They might even crack a joke. They're sitting up straight in their chair. They're relaxing instead of sort of gripping the arms of the chair. These are all mood transformations that the brain is so happy to make if it can only have the minimal amount of protein nutrition that it really needs.
Right. And this is, I think, really important to know that you had an actual experience. It was a Native American woman, I believe, that came into your office that way, right? She was very slumped, and you gave her just a little bit of what she needed, and all of a sudden she's like, wow.
Well, no, she wasn't like, wow. She's never going to be like, wow. And a lot of Native Americans just don't ever get like that.
Okay.
But
more stoic.
The change, the sparkle in the eye and the erect posture and the smiles. And we actually started doing it because we didn't know what else to do. She was brought in by the tribal health clinic staff. She actually volunteered because she was interested in nutrition. She had worked out in gyms and been given amino acids, and that sounded fine to her. So she came down. But what they didn't tell me before they brought her was that she almost never talked. She'd come into the session. She never missed a session of counseling, but she never said anything. And so without getting her to say anything, I didn't know how to help her. So I thought, okay, we have a chart. Actually, I'm sitting in a room that has this chart, which is like a mini version of the questionnaire in graphic form. And I brought it in and I showed it to her and I said, if I point to a set of symptoms on this 5-part chart, will you nod if you have them?
Mm.
And that's what we did. I pointed and she nodded, and I pointed and she nodded, and I pointed and she nodded. There wasn't a single area of her brain that was functional.
Wow.
So we just started at the top with an energizing amino acid that fuels the part of the brain that gives us particularly mental energy. And, within 5 minutes, everyone in the room was looking at the other person next to them, raising their eyebrows in disbelief, because from sitting completely still with no expression, with her eyes lowered, she was tracking everyone. Her eyes were bright. She was sitting up straight. She was moving, like she was crossing her legs and
she was engaged.
Yes.
Wow.
So it's a great story, and I try and tell it in all of my books because I'm so concerned about the Native American population of the United States.
Right. And I think that the Native American population is very similar to what we have here in Hawaii, where the Native population has been marginalized. They're, living, well, they don't really live in reservations here, but they're basically the diet has been reduced to supermarket fare. Let's put it that way. So they tend to be food deserts in many ways. And I believe, even if they are, maybe growing their own maize, let's say, there's still, just this proliferation of junk foods. Now, how do I'm not going to call them junk foods. I'm going to call them the anti-foods. Okay. Cause you got, Christ and the Antichrist, you got food and you got the anti-food, right? So, so the anti-foods that these people are eating, how do they mimic the brain chemicals that people really are trying to get at when they would have eaten in the past some bison, some fish, some dairy? Well,
keeping in mind that it's not just anti-food, it's not food. It's high. There are calories in it.
Right.
To that extent, it's food, but they're really drug substances. And in the last 10 or 15 years, there's actually been research on, what do these substances, these edible substances, do in the brain? And there's a lot of information now about what they do. And it turns out that they have drug-like effects on the same 5 areas of the brain that are supposed to be generating a good mood. And they can force an increase in the production in those 5 areas of the brain so that you get a brief sense of relief.
Right.
and it's a drug process, and so there's withdrawal if you don't have the foods, and so it self-perpetuates that way.
Right. And because it's such a dramatic effect, I would assume that that's part of the draw. I mean, first of all, there's the desire, I think, on the behalf of many people where they want to be, let's say, healthy. And, the government says it's okay. And the government says I shouldn't eat as much meat or as much fat. So you're avoiding those. So those are just out of the question. But all you're left with are these drug-like substances, which,
That's right.
which, if I understand what you're saying here, is not only the sugar, high fructose corn syrup, super refined starches, but it's also these additional chemicals that sometimes we don't even know what they are. Anything that can be piggybacking flavor enhancers and artificial colors and that stuff as well, right?
Well, I'm actually talking about fructose dominant sugars.
Okay.
And white flour. So, white flour is an old companion of the human race at this point.
Right.
But when you combine high fructose syrups, and that includes agave and fruit syrups, as a matter of fact, apple syrup or apple juice has more fructose than Coca-Cola.
Absolutely. I'm always trying to get people to understand that. They don't, they try to patronize me, say, oh, well, I only eat foods that are naturally fruit juice sweetened. And I'm saying, do you even know what you're saying?
Well, no, they don't, because nobody wants them to know. It's not common knowledge. And it sounds impossible that anything derived from a fruit could be a problem, but then sugar is derived from sugar cane, which is a fabulous plant.
Exactly. If you just a piece of sugar cane is beautiful. it's not a punch in the face the way refined sugar is, and that's the same for an apple versus concentrated apple juice.
Well, and oddly enough, sugar that comes from the cane or the beet has a locked-in ratio of fructose to glucose. It's 50-50.
Right.
Fructose cannot dominate. It's only in the 70s when we introduced this corn syrup that could be manipulated in terms of the amount of fructose in relation to glucose that we started getting into trouble, because we've been eating about 160 pounds of sucrose, table sugar, a year in the 60s.
Right.
Without a weight problem. We had cavities for sure, and our heart health was deteriorating. But on the other hand, we'd also been eating hydrogenated fat since the 30s. So when you combine the new sugars with the old flours, which also shock the system, especially in the amounts that we're eating, and not mixed with proteins and good fats, and you add things that are necessary to life, but also somewhat addictive, like salt and fat. They're both pleasurable. Salt is, required for life, actually. So, and now we're adding marijuana to the mixes, and that's not even mentioning chocolate, and of course caffeine. So we've got these blends of addictive substances, and anybody who's ever been around addicts knows the concept of a speedball, and that's what we have going, is these combinations that create what they call a bliss point, where all of the neurotransmitters in the brain are just firing briefly, but just magnificently. So we've got, an orgasmic kind of experience going that we just keep wanting to get back to.
So at the beginning, I talked about Dr. Delaveau. He's the French doctor who has, he actually created this diet in the 80s, which I have seen it for ages and just never actually read the book. And I was somewhere and I saw the book on a shelf and I read it. And he talks about how when we don't eat enough, he said, if you have a craving for candy or cake or whatever in the afternoon, you did not eat enough protein for lunch. He said you need to eat up to, for the average person, we're talking average heights and so on, will need to eat about half a pound of protein at lunch to stave off that those cravings. And so, I always test everything on myself before I recommend it to anyone else. And I try it and I'm like, he's absolutely right. And
well,
I can
what mothers taught us, drilled into us in the 50s and 60s, you cannot skip a meal.
Right.
Because it's going to, and you can't eat junk because it'll ruin your appetite. And, there was just common knowledge at that point. How do you spell his last name?
Oh, Delabos.
Well, it's lovely to hear about someone in Europe who has such wisdom and common sense.
Yeah, he's, it stems a little bit off of I shouldn't say, but I guess a lot of people might think of his diet as very similar to Atkins, but he does have some differences, from the early stages. And, he's also talking about, slow weight loss, which nobody wants to hear in this country. We need it yesterday, right? He's talking about, you can lose just, 2 to 4 pounds a month. That's fine. Just let your body let go of those extra pounds. By eating in this very structured way.
Well, let me go somewhere.
Okay.
I think that this country is ready for this kind of information because of the poor Biggest Losers, who's, I don't know if you know about it, there was a study done on them 6 years after
yes.
A group of them, competed, successfully losing a tremendous amount of weight collectively. And what they found was that they're in the process of starving themselves to enable them to do this. They had slowed their calorie burning capacity down by 500 calories a day.
Yes.
And so that's why they were regaining weight and had to continue to exercise full time just to slow down the weight gain.
Right.
Even though they weren't eating very much. And in addition, their starvation had set off something new for them, a whole new level of food cravings, so that the battle that they had was so much more difficult. And there was only one person who had been able to keep the weight off. And she was a woman who said every waking moment was a screaming for, some kind of food that she felt she couldn't eat. So that's opened the door to looking very seriously at the dangers of low-calorie dieting. And the dangers of low-calorie dieting were obvious to me in the 1980s because I was the head of an eating disorders treatment program. And my background is in psychotherapy, which is how I get involved in mood problems and eating disorders, which at the time we thought were psychological. But those of us who were really specialists in eating disorders were looking at the research, which showed that people who developed anorexia and bulimia were developing these problems in direct reaction to low-calorie dieting.
Mm-hmm.
So it was very clear that it was very dangerous to me. And so I wrote a book called The Diet Cure. It was my first book. And my idea was to really stop dieting, as the most serious threat to our mental and physical health and our normal weight. And it was later that I learned about the amino acids as cures for mood problems. But initially we used the amino acids as cures for craving so that people would not have to diet because they would be satisfied with moderate amounts of food that would not put weight on them.
Right.
And we had the same kind of instant success with food cravings using these amino acid supplements as we subsequently had with mood problems using this very same amino acid. So you get this extraordinary double whammy benefit from feeding the brain exactly what it needs. And when I say feed, I'm talking about jump-starting it with nutritional supplements, but then as soon as the appetite is normalized, people start eating adequate, generous levels of protein so that over time they don't need the supplements anymore.
Right. So is there, because so many people are resistant to taking supplements, and it's always the people who need it the most. I only get my nutrition from food, and they're drinking a Diet Coke. So, is there a way to only to satisfy the brain's needs only through food, or do you find it critical for people to introduce for 1, 3, 12 months some amino acids to balance them out before they can truly transition to just food?
Well, there is no generality. Everybody's different. And there are people who are close enough to health that if they are willing to increase the amount of concentrated animal protein in their diets, they will get most of the benefits that other people have to use these supplements to get. There are people who just cannot eat well long enough to make the changes because they crave these drug foods so much. The supplements turn off those cravings, which means that they're left with, their native appetite, and they can start eating the kind of brain and body healthy diet that will allow them to sustain without lifetime use of supplements.
Right. So tell us about what are you said there's 5 chemicals that our brain needs to function adequately. Most people know about serotonin. They've heard the word endorphins. What are the other 3?
Well, let's slow down though. They may have heard the word serotonin and endorphin, but they may not know how it applies to appetite. So serotonin is our natural antidepressant. And in fact, we eat when we're depressed in order to get a little bit of a serotonin boost. And I won't go into the brain chemistry that allows that to happen briefly, but just so that the questionnaire identifies, is this a low serotonin craver, a low serotonin depressive, or not? It's very easy to identify a low serotonin person. So, and they typically are depressed as well as having cravings. And then we've got the low endorphin person who is pretty sensitive to pain and craves comfort food. So endorphins are natural painkiller, and it's hundreds of times more potent than heroin, actually, if we have enough of it. We don't need comfort food if we have enough of it.
We don't need heroin, apparently, either.
That's right. We don't. We certainly did not have an epidemic of it when we were eating a high-protein diet. So then we have a natural tranquilizer called GABA, short for something that I'm sure you don't even want me to mention, a 5-syllable word. But GABA is another one of these marvelous things that can instantly interfere with stress. So we get people who come in who are terribly tense, neck and shoulders tight, sitting up rigidly, just really unable to relax. And 5 minutes with a supplement of GABA itself, which is easily available in all health food stores, and their shoulders drop, they start to smile, they're sort of lounging in the chair instead of stiffly propping themselves up. So when about 70% of people who are overstressed eat over it. Some people are overstressed and they can't eat, but 70% of people nibble or gorge when they're stressed to try and get a little more access to GABA. And then we've got our natural stimulant, which is like a natural caffeine. And those chemicals are called the catecholamines, and we call them the CATs for short. Again, there's an amino acid that feeds the part of the brain that makes these natural stimulants, so that people who are looking for energy from chocolate, which is a big draw for chocolate eaters, and sometimes just straight sugar will give them what they need to keep on going and get through the day. The people who are nibbling on Kisses or chewing sugar gum, or just keeping themselves at their desks through the use of sugar.
Can I just ask a question here? This whole thing that we're seeing right now, because coffee was out a few years ago. In recent years, it's come back with a vengeance. It's, you can drink 3 to 6 cups of coffee a day and it'll be great for you. You need to drink it, and this bulletproof stuff. is this just wishful thinking? Are people who are jumping on that bandwagon, are they missing this crucial point of the catecholamines?
They're missing it, all right. They're really deficient. They do not have enough energy to function.
Right.
That's the only reason people are drawn to these massive amounts of caffeine, is that they really help them out temporarily. But you're right about the disastrous results of overdoing caffeine. We had a guy who had developed an energy drink addiction. He's a home working computer guy, and he hid it from his wife. He was drinking 9 energy drinks a day, and he had a series of strokes. He was only 37 years old. And this is getting quite common, but it comes from this terrible deficiency condition that we're in. So the empty foods create the deficiency, and yet they give us a little relief from it at the same time, so that we never get well. So the amino acid techniques, although not everyone needs them, if they're willing and able to radically increase the amount of protein that they're eating 3 times a day, a lot of people who do that, even if they end up needing some aminos as well, notice the first red meat meal that we've had several people who said, I could even feel the area of my brain that was changing while I was eating it.
Mm.
These are people who had been vegans.
Yeah. Leah Keith has a very similar story. When we talked to her, she talked about just feeling her all the blood rush back into her body, and her brain just started to fire. And she, what she went into with a lot of trepidation, which is eating a can of fish with a plastic fork. She couldn't stop herself. She said she was her brain totally took over, and there was just no turning back.
Eating animal protein was what allowed us to evolve from primates to humans. We developed our brain based on animal protein. And, if someone wants to argue with me about whether that was a good thing or not, I don't know what to say about that. But now that we're 2 million years beyond that decision to develop our brains to the point that we are, we can't maintain it without the primal food that allowed it to develop in the first place.
Right. And I don't know if you're seeing the same thing, but I'm in the autistic community. I am seeing a staggering amount of children who have not been vaccinated, and yet the mom is vegan or vegetarian. And I can't help but think there's a connection there.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, I was privileged to be in numerous mothering groups and La Leche groups and groups where, I'm not saying that vaccines are totally off the hook. I just think it's the nail in the coffin. I think that these kids are starting out deficient, and then you add something on top of it because you're like, oh, I don't do everything, so I should give them the shot. And I'm like, no, that's the worst time to give them the shot. But that, the shot aside, I think that what we're seeing is that a lot of these children are missing the brain chemistry. And they're missing a lot of other things other than just brain chemistry. But they do. It would appear to me, based on the work that you've done, the exposure that I've had to various communities and other doctors and clinically, that there is a strong connection between not feeding the mother and then expecting the brain of the child to develop normally.
Well, again,
to our, I was going to say, to our current evolved state.
It's hard to get through to people, though, because there's there's such a passion and sort of a cult-like mentality around certain foods and certain diets. And it started in the 70s. That was the decade of cults. And the cult around low-fat and vegetarian eating really took hold. And in spite of the fact that it was very clear, all the research is crystal clear. There are graphs of suicides, graphs of depression, graphs of weight gain, and they all correlate to graphs of diminished protein, saturated fat, fiber, vitamins and minerals. It's very clear what's happened, and research is there. But I'm writing a new book, and I'm hoping to help people get over this hump and see, exactly what happened. Because people who are younger don't really believe, because they haven't visually or viscerally experienced a world where people are normal weight. I grew up in that world. They don't know. It's a question of trust and faith that maybe it really was like that. I'm planning to have a big website associated with the new book that will just give hours and hours of videotape of people walking around in the 40s, 50s, and 60s.
Yeah. And then contrasting that to places today. I mean, I'm thinking New York City. One of the big excuses is that we don't move enough. You have to walk everywhere in New York. You have to walk everywhere in Philly. There's no shortage of obese people walking around in these cities. But what you do see, and my last trip to France, I saw this actually, the obese people will be walking around with pastries and bags of chips.
Yeah. Well, the last time I was in New York, it was a snowstorm, so nobody was on the street, so I didn't get to see what was going on. And before that, it had actually been about 10 years, and there wasn't such an obvious problem of obesity then. And I was thinking, well, on the coast, we're more active, so we haven't been suffering as much as fast, but from what you're saying, it's a clearly visible problem there now.
Maybe you don't hang out in my neighborhood. I don't know. But there is, it does definitely depend in some cases, because you go into the more, I guess, do they even use the term yuppie even anymore? But the more, young urban working groups in those areas, you tend to see less of it. But you go into the neighborhoods where just the everyday people, live and work, and you're seeing, you will definitely see it more there. But you really see it everywhere. I really can't, probably less in New York than in, for example, Philadelphia. Although Philadelphia supposedly has come a long way in recent years, but, there's definitely no shortage of obesity in either city from my experience. So I want to ask you something, because you're talking about eating more animal protein. This scares the bejesus out of people. I know that with Dr. Atkins, people, they just basically were just throwing tomatoes at him, right? Anything they could do to make him seem like a quack, make him seem crazy. He was putting people in danger.
But the truth is that the reason they were throwing tomatoes was because so many people were and still are
profiting.
That he was right, that he was the one voice of sanity from the 70s on, which he was.
Right.
So a lot of people didn't get derailed by the bad press, but you're right, a lot of people did.
Right. Where I was going with this actually is that, now we're seeing people who are moving more towards the fats, which is fine, the animal fats, because we definitely need those. And it's still, I guess what it is there's still this taboo around saying you need more protein. You see where I'm going with this? So it's like, who's going to say a vegetable is bad? It's kind of the flip side of the same coin. So everybody has not everybody, obviously, but, many people have collectively agreed that we get too much protein. We don't need so much protein. You're one of the few people still saying we need more protein, whereas, some people, they've admitted, yes, we take too many carbs, but we're going to eat more fat and still keep the protein moderate or low.
Okay, so that's it for today. We'll be back next week to conclude this conversation with Julia Ross. We're going to talk about what protein really is, how the body reacts when you suddenly increase your calorie intake to 2,100, and why the internet is an unreliable source of information unless you know what to look for. Come back next week.
The Nutrition Heretic Podcast is a production of Savor the Journey, LLC. Our audio editor is Nikola Popovich. Our podcast manager is Crystal McLean, and our operations manager is Linda Hansen. I'm your host, Adrienne Hugh, the Nutrition Heretic. You can find us at nutritionheretic.com, where you can download the Nutrition Heretics free shit list of 7 health foods to avoid like the plague. You can also listen to previous episodes at nutritionheretic.com/podcast. Be sure to like us on social media for updates. Our Facebook page is facebook.com/nutritionheretic and on Twitter at NutriHeretic. Contact us with show ideas, questions, or if you just want to be a guest. And don't forget to rate our podcast on iTunes and Stitcher. Thanks.